Nübüvvet, hakikat arayışında peygamber ışığı.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to my esteemed scholars, guests, students, everyone here that is a student of life and of nursing. I want to dedicate my work to you students because it is for you, at least for my part, that I do my work and study for. And I want to thank the host, the symposium, Dr. Faris Kaya, and everyone that made this possible. I hope that it will be as wonderful and enriching experience as for all of you as it has been for me. I'd like to sort of readjust the title of my paper a bit as I have come to complete work on the study that I have begun. And I'd like to call it Nursing in the Synoptic Gospels, the creation of a prophetic archetype. As a historian, it is my job to look at the sort of phenomenon that spans throughout time. And the phenomenon that I am looking at is the socio-historical and religious phenomenon of prophethood that seems to happen throughout religions. I'd like to note that I'm quite new to nursing study. It has been less than a year that I have been exposed to nursing, and I hope that with further revisions, insight, and progress, that this prophetic archetype will be utilized and this study will get further completion. With humanity, there was always a need and desire throughout history for a leader, religiously, to help it explain our position of life, and that has been seen through prophethood. The best way to understand this prophethood is through the example and sort of archetype that I construct through Syed Nursi and his understanding of prophets, prophethood, and humanity's need for one. I like to look at two of the Gospels within the Bible, in the New Testament, Matthew and Luke, to help reinforce this archetype and a step to utilize this archetype of Syed Nursi to look across the religious spectrum. The Jesus that is found within these two Gospels, quoted by Bart D. Erdman in Matthew as being new Moses, and then Luke as a universal prophet, to help understand prophethood within Jesus. It is my hope that this will be utilized even further in different stages. With Nursi's universal teaching and with his more pluralistic teaching, as my colleague has noted, can be the perfect framework for the prophetic archetype. There is a portion of my paper, of course, that I'm going to be skipping. It was the historical component of the Bible. As a historian, I like to take away anything in question in order to make something workable, malleable, instead of seeing it as transcendent. I hope that all of you will read this portion of the paper, particularly my understanding of the phenomenon of Son of God, a phrase that is used in the first century often, particularly for contemporaries of Jesus like Apollonius of Tirana, in order to make it workable for you and to be able to get past terms that many people see as impossible to look past in order to use the Bible as a historical document. This, of course, does not question the validity of Christianity either, but merely attempts to expand upon our understanding. So what is Nursi's definition of a prophetic archetype, as I understand it? Being new to Nursi, I took things that I could find to help me understand prophethood. The first component of a prophetic archetype is the seeming need for it in humankind. A very common quote within this conference, and one that Nursi has utilized, was, "Divine power does not leave the ant without a leader, or bees without a queen. It surely would not leave mankind without a prophet or code of laws. In any case, the order of the world demands this." That is the first part of prophethood. The second one is that human beings, within Nursi's understanding, prophets, would be the perfect among us. As Nursi says, since he, God, will speak to mankind, he will speak to those who are most perfect, most worthy of address, highest in morality, and of the highest disposition in morality. They will guide humanity. That is, of course, a second aspect of prophethood, one that is seemingly perfect. Prophethood also is an example of mankind's good, its perfect foundation. Prophethood is mankind, quoted by Nursi, is the summary and foundation of man's good and perfection. Since in this world a shining beauty, an extensive and exalted good, an evident truth, and a superior perfection are apparent, self-evidently truth and reality rely in prophethood and in the hands of prophets. This is another component that I have seen necessary to understanding a prophetic archetype. Another component, and something that I see is significantly important, is the fact that prophets see matters in two ways. The eternal truth as being something that is fixed, something that is self-evident and transcends throughout the ages, whereas secondary matters, things that become components of everyday life, is something that can be shed, but still exists throughout the ages. As Nursi says, even more, God has made it easy for us to make our will conform to the divine by sending prophets and messengers, none of whom were divine or semi-divine, to show us how to live in a way that will earn his good pleasure. And since all of them were fully human, we can aspire toward an even more perfect imitation of them and understand all of their teachings. He also notes that prophets, while seemingly distant from one another, provided the same message, as Nursi says. At the time of the early prophets, people were physically and intellectually distant from each other. Their characters were somewhat coarse and violent, and their minds were primitive. The laws for the time were different and appropriate to their conditions. Similarly, divine wisdom requires divine ordinances of secondary importance, and that they should differ according to those who follow them. This result in different schools, all of which were right, showing, of course, perfectly within the idea of Jesus that there is some divine rightness that comes through despite secondary matters. The prophets, as Nursi noted, all followed in the principles and faiths and the fundamental rules, for these are constant and fixed, unlike secondary matters, the nature of which is to the change of the course of time. This, of course, is very significant in understanding prophethood. Finally, prophets were heralds to the heavens, as is noted in Nursi's flashes, and they reveal the divine, because without them divine would not be noted. Just as Nursi states, just as the universe points to its maker, so it requires and demands an elevated herald, a truthful discoverer, an exacting master, a faithful teacher, who will know the divine's purposes in its creation and make them known, and will teach the instances of dominical wisdom in its changes and announce the results of its dutiful motions, and proclaim its value and perfections of the goings with it. The other attributes that Nursi points out for prophets and really help drive home a prophetic archetype are the components of compassion, foresight, a sense of duty and humility, authoritativeness, social justice, a call to change, and an everlasting need to please God, all of which could be found in Nursi's flashes. This is just a general outline of attributes and aspects that help to create a prophetic archetype, a prophet that would fit within this category. It is no means perfect, and it still needs some work. There are other attributes that, of course, are given to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but we will not discuss them in this very brief time. They may assist in forming this archetype, but not quite yet. So my paper, of course, looks to identify a prophet utilizing this archetype, but instead, I would like to use an archetype as a methodological tool in order to help discover universality instead of searching for identification of a prophet. There are some key points when we look at the Gospel of Matthew that helps to show Jesus as a prophet fitting within this archetype. 2 points that I would like to highlight are noting the fixed belief, this fixed truth that Nursi talks about, particularly when we examine the Sermon on the Mount, the aspect of the Beatitude, which was calling for social change. The second point was reinforcing this nature by looking at the mentioned golden rule within the Gospel of Matthew. I don't know if many of you have heard of the Beatitudes within the Gospel of Matthew, but I'd like to briefly mention them to you. And he, Jesus, opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men rival you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so men persecute the prophets who were before you. Within Nursi, we see a call for social change, but yet we see a call for the fixed truth, the truth that is evident in religion. It is here within this portion of the Gospel of Matthew that you see Jesus going about, looking at the secondary matters that were seemingly part of culture, but that needed to change in order to bring about the truth that had somehow gotten lost within society. The second point within the Gospel of Matthew was what we call the Golden Rule. The Golden Rule in Christianity is a very basic rule that Jesus took the corpus of the Jewish Torah in order to bring the solid one commandment that is the easiest for us to understand. And I quote the Gospel of Matthew. And one of them, a lawyer, asked Jesus a question to test him. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? And he said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and a gospel that Bart D. Erdman says provides a universal prophet, and the goodness is part of the prophetic archetype in order to give it some substance. In the Gospel of Luke, we see that Jesus' goodness is easily known to others, something that Nursi says is very significant in prophethood. He stuck out particularly for me, Jesus, as having a desire to please the everlasting, a point that Nursi says is necessary in prophethood. I quote the Gospel of Luke briefly, saying in one portion that Jesus said, begging before the passion to be spared, Father, if thou art willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. In his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. This, of course, shows that Jesus put his own desires aside so that God's will be done, and a desire to please the everlasting. There are other portions that we can question that Nursi brings up about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam describing prophethood that come close to Jesus within the Gospels, of angelic revelation and, of course, ascension, but there is not enough time. To conclude, my prophetic archetype still needs a lot of work. It is not a perfect model. But with further research and tweaking, and more understanding of Nursi, I hope to create an archetype that could be utilized to span universally across religions. This would further assist the spirit of Nursi's universal understanding of prophets, prophethood, and the essentiality it has to mankind. Thank you.
İstanbul İlim ve Kültür Vakfı